Picture Amsterdam in the winter of 1636. Snow is falling outside a tavern near the flower market, and inside men in wool coats are hunched over a ledger, arguing about a flower that is not in the room. It is not in anyone's pocket. It is not even above ground. Somewhere outside the city, under frozen soil, a bulb is sitting dormant, months away from blooming, and these men are negotiating its price as if it were sitting on the table in front of them. This is the moment most people think they understand. A country loses its mind over flowers. Prices rise until a single bulb is worth more than a house. Bakers and blacksmiths abandon their trades to become bulb traders. Then, in February of 1637, the whole thing collapses overnight, and with it, so the story goes, the Dutch economy itself. It has become the founding myth of every market crash that came after it. The original cautionary tale, repeated in economics textbooks, dinner party conversations, and every crypto skeptic's favorite metaphor. Here is the problem. Almost none of that is what actually happened. The mania did not touch most of the Dutch population. It did not bankrupt the nation. Houses were not literally traded for bulbs, at least not in the way the legend insists. And the crash, when it came, was absorbed by the Dutch Republic so completely that trade barely stumbled. What collapsed in February 1637 was not the Dutch economy. It was a very specific, very new kind of paper contract, traded by a relatively small circle of merchants. And the reason it did not take the rest of the country down with it is itself the most important economic lesson in the whole story. So the real question is not, why did people go crazy over flowers? The real question is this: what happens when a society invents a powerful new financial instrument before it invents the rules to contain it? And why did this particular experiment end in a controlled unwind instead of a genuine catastrophe? To answer that, you have to stop looking at the tulip and start looking at the paper wrapped around it. Start with what was actually being traded, because it was almost never the flower itself. By the winter of 1636, the vast majority of tulip transactions in Holland were not exchanges of physical bulbs. They were contracts, agreements to buy a specific bulb, still in the ground, for a fixed price to be delivered after it was lifted the following summer. The mania began not with flowers changing hands, but with paper contracts, as traders bought and sold bulbs that did not yet exist during the planting season. The Dutch called this wind handle, literally wind trade, trading in air. This was not some novel form of madness invented out of nowhere. Dutch merchants had been trading futures contracts on grain, herring, and spices for decades before anyone thought to apply the same structure to a flower. The tulip market did not invent financial speculation. It borrowed an existing, functional piece of financial infrastructure, the futures contract, and pointed it at a new, oddly perfect target. An asset that was rare, visually spectacular, impossible to mass-produce quickly, and whose value depended almost entirely on a random biological accident. That accident is worth pausing on because it explains why tulips specifically became the vehicle for this experiment, and not, say, cabbages. The most prized tulips of the era carried dramatic flame-like streaks of color, a striking break from the plain, solid petals of ordinary bulbs. These patterns were caused by a mosaic virus that altered the color of the petals, and varieties like the Semper Augustus, with its vivid red and white flames, were valued far above others. Nobody in the 17th century understood the biology. What they understood was scarcity. You could not simply plant more Semper Augustus bulbs to meet demand. The virus that created the pattern also weakened the plant's ability to reproduce quickly, and each bulb could only produce a small number of offsets per year. Scarcity that cannot be manufactured on demand is exactly the kind of asset that speculative capital loves to chase, because supply cannot simply expand to meet a price spike. Now put a financial instrument on top of that biological bottleneck and add one more ingredient: leverage. Buying one of these contracts did not require paying the full price up front. A buyer typically put down a small deposit to secure the right to purchase a bulb at a fixed price later, sometimes as little as 2.5% of the contract's value. Think about what that number actually means. With a deposit of 2.5%, A trader could control 40 times as much tulip exposure as the cash they actually had in hand. A modest sum of money did not just buy a flower, it bought the right to a much larger position. And if the price of that position rose, the trader's actual return on the small deposit they put down was not double or triple. It could be 40 times over. This is the machine, not the tulip. The machine is leverage sitting on top of engineered scarcity, wrapped in a contract structure with almost no institutional oversight, traded informally in taverns among men who called themselves, half-jokingly, colleges. Self-organized trading clubs with their own customs and enforcement norms, but no central clearinghouse, no margin calls, no regulator standing behind the paper. When that machine works, it works spectacularly. Between November 1636 and February 1637, contract prices for common bulbs rose roughly 20-fold, while rarer varieties climbed 10-fold or more. That is not a market drifting upward. That is a market being pulled skyward by the mechanics of the instrument itself, almost independent of how much anyone actually valued the flower sitting underground. Let's put real numbers on a single contract, because this is where the story stops being an abstraction and starts being math. Say a trader in December 1636 wants exposure to a mid-tier bulb variety with a contract price of 100 guilders. A meaningful sum, roughly what a skilled craftsman might earn in a couple of months of steady work. The trader does not pay 100 guilders. He puts down a deposit of 2.5 guilders, about 2.5%, to secure the contract. That deposit is his entire capital at risk, on paper. Now the broader contract market does what it did that winter. Prices for that class of bulb rise by a factor of 10 over 8 weeks. The trader's contract, still unsettled, is now theoretically worth 1,000 guilders. He has not touched a single flower. He has not delivered anything. But if he can sell that contract to someone else before delivery day, his 2.5 guilder deposit has become the basis for a 900 guilder paper gain. That is the appeal in one sentence. A small, real amount of cash controlling a large, unrealized position in an asset nobody in the transaction actually intends to plant in their garden. Here is where it gets interesting, because that same math runs in reverse just as violently. If the price of the underlying contract falls instead of rises, the buyer is still on the hook for the full contracted price at delivery, not just the deposit. The deposit was never the total exposure. It was the entry fee. The real liability was the full face value of the bulb the buyer had agreed to purchase, months in the future at a price fixed back when the market was still climbing. Leverage does not create asymmetric upside without also creating asymmetric downside. It just hides the downside behind a small number at the moment of purchase. That asymmetry is what turned an overheated but contained luxury market into a full unwind. Through January 1637, the chain of buyers kept extending. A contract signed in November would be resold in December to someone willing to pay more, who resold it again in January to someone willing to pay even more, each new buyer betting not on the tulip itself, but on finding another buyer further down the chain before delivery day arrived. This is the defining feature of every speculative bubble that came after it, from railway shares to dot-com stocks to crypto tokens. The object being traded stops mattering, and the only thing that matters is whether there is a next buyer. Then, on a single day in early February 1637, the chain ran out. At a routine bulb auction in Harlem, buyers simply failed to show up. It was not a dramatic crash triggered by some external shock. No war, no famine, no foreign invasion. It was simpler and, in a strange way, scarier than that. For the first time in months, the auctioneer called for bids on a lot of bulbs, and nobody answered. One empty room in one town was enough to break the spell, because the entire structure of rising prices depended on the shared belief that a buyer would always be found. The moment that belief cracked in Harlem, word spread through the trading network within days, and the price discovery that had been running only in one direction for 2 months violently reversed. Follow the chain from there, because this is where the real mechanism of collapse becomes visible. The Harlem auction fails to clear, which means the contract prices agreed just days earlier are now unsupported. Nobody will pay those prices anymore. Traders holding contracts signed at peak prices in late January now face buyers demanding to pay a fraction of the agreed amount or refusing to buy at all. Sellers try to unload contracts before delivery obligations come due, which floods the informal market with offers and accelerates the price collapse. Buyers who committed to purchase bulbs at high fixed prices, expecting to resell before delivery, now find themselves contractually obligated to pay far more than the bulbs are currently worth to anyone. Trust between trading partners, which had underpinned an entirely informal, tavern-based contract system with no legal enforcement mechanism built for this scale, evaporates. Within roughly a week, a market that had been the talk of the Dutch Republic for 2 months simply stops functioning. This is the point in the story where the popular myth insists the Dutch economy went down with it. It did not. And understanding why it did not is the actual reversal at the heart of this whole subject. First, scale. The mania was never a nationwide phenomenon touching ordinary Dutch households. It was confined to a relatively small group of wealthy collectors and merchants, and most participants in the Dutch Republic were never involved and were not ruined by the crash. The image of bakers and chimney sweeps trading away their life savings for bulbs is largely a later embellishment, useful for a morality tale, but not representative of who was actually holding these contracts. The people most exposed were merchants and traders who already operated in speculative markets, the same class of people who traded futures on grain and herring. This was a correction inside a niche high-leverage derivatives market, not a run on the general economy. Second, and more important, is the policy response. Dutch authorities faced a genuine crisis of contract enforcement in the spring of 1637. Thousands of legally binding agreements, signed at wildly inflated prices, that could not realistically be honored without triggering a cascade of bankruptcies across the merchant class. In May 1637, the authorities effectively nullified the tulip futures contracts, treating them as gambling debts rather than enforceable legal obligations. This is the single most consequential decision in the entire episode, and it rarely gets mentioned in the popular version of the story. By reclassifying the contracts as wagers rather than debts, the courts released buyers from the full weight of their obligations. Sellers could pursue only a small fraction of the agreed price, often around 10%, rather than the full contracted amount. It was not a bailout, and it was not painless, but it converted what could have been a wave of forced liquidations and merchant bankruptcies into a contained, absorbed loss, spread thin enough that it did not metastasize into the broader credit system. The result: Dutch GDP did not collapse, trade continued largely uninterrupted, and the broader golden age of Dutch commerce rolled on for another generation. The Dutch East India Company kept sailing. Amsterdam kept functioning as Europe's dominant financial and trading hub. Historically, the Tulip episode did not critically influence the prosperity of the Dutch Republic, which remained the world's leading financial and economic power throughout the 17th century. The crash that supposedly broke a nation left barely a mark on its GDP. So who actually lost money and who came out ahead? This is where the real winners and losers of the story emerge, and they are not who the legend suggests. The clearest losers were the traders caught holding contracts at the very top of the market in late January 1637. Men who had bought in on the assumption that prices would keep climbing long enough for them to resell, and who were left instead with unenforceable paper and reputational damage in a merchant community built on trust. Some were genuinely ruined, particularly smaller traders who had leveraged themselves heavily to chase gains that everyone around them seemed to be capturing. The legal nullification protected them from total wipeout, but it did not make them whole. The clearest winners, strange as it sounds, were the sellers who exited early. The growers and collectors who sold contracts near the peak in December and January locked in extraordinary prices and were never fully repaid once the courts intervened, but who had already captured meaningful gains before the collapse began. There is also a quieter, less obvious winner: the Dutch legal and commercial system itself. The tulip crisis forced Dutch courts and merchant guilds to confront, for perhaps the first time at this scale, the question of how to treat a purely speculative financial contract when its enforcement threatens systemic stability. The answer they arrived at: treat runaway speculative debt as a wager, not a claim, when full enforcement would be more destructive than partial forgiveness, became a template that resurfaces again and again across financial history, long after anyone remembered where the idea started. This is the second business hiding underneath the flower business, and it is the actual value the Tulip Mania left behind. The visible product was a bulb. The real product, the one that mattered for centuries afterward, was a live experiment in financial engineering. How futures contracts scale when leverage is cheap. How quickly a chain of resales can turn a niche luxury good into a system-wide contract crisis. And how a legal system can choose to absorb that crisis rather than let it cascade. The same force is at work in those Amsterdam taverns. Leverage amplifying returns, financial innovation lowering the barrier to speculation, and social proof pulling in participants, once everyone around them appeared to be profiting, are the identical mechanics behind the South Sea bubble roughly 80 years later, the railway mania 2 centuries after that, and the dot-com and crypto cycles closer to our own time. The tulip did not teach the world anything about flowers. It taught the world what happens structurally every single time when a small deposit is allowed to control a large, illiquid, hard-to-value position, and a chain of buyers is required to keep extending indefinitely for the structure to hold. Now run the two versions of this story side by side, because the gap between them is the whole point. In the good scenario, the one most people carry around in their heads, a nation loses its collective mind. Ordinary citizens gamble away their homes on flowers, the market implodes, and the Dutch Republic pays for decades of irrational exuberance with a broken economy. It is a satisfying story precisely because it is simple. Greed causes madness, madness causes ruin, ruin is total. In the real scenario, a narrow, sophisticated derivatives market, built on tools the Dutch had already been using for grain and herring, got pushed to an extreme by cheap leverage and an asset with genuinely engineered scarcity, cracked in a single failed auction, and was contained by a specific legal decision that reclassified the debt before it could spread. The difference between those two versions is not a matter of degree. It is a difference in what kind of system actually failed and what kind of system actually held. That is the answer to the question this whole story was built around. The tulip did not determine the outcome. The contract structure wrapped around the tulip did. And so did the institutional response once that structure buckled. A flower cannot cause an economic catastrophe. A financial instrument with unlimited leverage and no circuit breaker can come close, and the only reason this particular one did not go further is that the people holding legal authority over those contracts chose deliberately not to enforce them to the letter. So picture that Amsterdam tavern one more time. The one from the opening. The ledger on the table, the men arguing over a bulb still buried under frozen ground somewhere outside the city walls. They were not gambling on a flower. They did not even fully understand what they were gambling on. What they were actually doing, without knowing it, was running the first large-scale field test of a piece of financial machinery that every generation since has rebuilt, renamed, and run again. Under different names, on different assets, in rooms that look nothing like a 17th century tavern, chasing the same instinct. A small amount of money, a large position, and the quiet assumption that someone else will always be there to buy it from you before the bill comes due. The tulip wilted in a season. The mechanism it revealed never did.